welcome back to another video in the Clinical Psychology Debunked series. Today, I'm Tanisha. If you haven't noticed, that's me. I am the creator behind Renae's Corner, and today we are going to be talking about the differences between a psychologist and a therapist. Basically, yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Strap in, get ready. You know, this is going to be mind-blowing information. Not really, it's not at all. I'm gonna be honest, it's kind of boring because psychology and therapy, they kind of overlap. Fun fact of the day. All right, so let's get right into it. So basically, first I wanted to start this video off by saying, like, the difference between a psychologist and a therapist is that they're very similar. There's not that many differences. And what I wanted to say about the term psychologist before we got started is that there are many different types of psychologists. And so for this video, I'm going to be talking mainly about clinical psychologists, but just keep in mind that there are neuropsychologists, there are developmental psychologists, there are industrial organizational psychologists, there are forensic psychologists, there are school psychologists, counseling psychologists, all different types of psychologists. Basically, psychologist just says that you study psychology. Doesn't matter what specialty, but it just is sort of like that blanket term. But when people think of psychology and psychologists, they often think about clinical psychology. Woo woo. I mean, I don't know if it's like a good thing or a bad thing, but I just wanted to say that up front. So this video is really focusing in on the differences between therapy, or being a therapist, and being a clinical psychologist. And so we're gonna start with being a therapist. So basically, a therapist is any kind of person who specializes in a specific kind of therapy. Like, that is literally the Google definition. Like, it's not very clear. And so it's sort of like this umbrella term to encapsulate a lot of different fields and a lot of different people. And so this includes social workers, this includes marriage and family therapists, it also includes life coaches, it also includes psychoanalysts, and also counseling, like college counseling centers too. And so basically they are providing therapy through various modalities. So many times in clinical psychology we use like cognitive behavioral therapy, but there are tons of different, well, not tons, but like there are different types of therapy modalities, and like what a life coach does is very different than what a marriage and family counselor or marriage and family therapist does. And so they both use therapy, but they just use different modalities of it. I hope that makes sense. I'm looking this way because I have notes, because, you know, gotta be prepared, gotta stay ready. And so basically, some can diagnose mental disorders while some can't. It really depends on their licensure, and it depends on their training. I would say that becoming a therapist is a shorter time span than becoming like a psychologist. And what I mean by that, it's a lot of times to be licensed as a therapist or licensed counselor, you just need a master's degree, which is only like 1 to 3 years, I think. I've only heard of like 1 to 2 years. I know that some people have 3 years programs, but it's a little bit shorter. And it's often thought of as people who help support other people through life decisions, through problems, through their symptoms of like anxiety or depression, sort of like, I would say, the more common mental disorders. And they're really like a source of support for people. So like if you're a marriage and family counselor or a marriage and family therapist, and I keep saying counselor, but it's like MFT in my head. So if you're like an MFT, you are really supporting people in their marriages and in their families. Or if you are a social worker, you are helping connect people to services and things like that. Also, social workers provide excellent therapy. And so basically a therapist is sort of like this umbrella term to encapsulate a lot of different people. Now, moving on to clinical psychologists. So technically, a clinical psychologist can be a therapist, and a lot of clinical psychologists that I know do therapy, and so they technically are a therapist. And so what kind of differentiates a clinical psychologist from like a traditional thought of therapist is that clinical psychology, we spend more time in school. Often to become a clinical psychologist, you have to have a doctorate degree, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You often work with a psychiatrist, but I will say that some therapists and social workers and other sort of mental health providers work with psychiatrists too. Yeah, so in addition to being a therapist, clinical psychologists are often researchers or professors, or they do consulting work, or they do assessments. And so it's like therapy is a part of being a clinical psychologist, but it doesn't have to be the only thing you do as a clinical psychologist. There is much more wide variety of what you can do as a clinical psychologist, rather like as opposed to like being an MFT. Unless you go on to be like a doctorate in MFT, and then you can go and do amazing things too. Let's think. So basically it's the same thing as therapy. As a clinical psychologist, you're really there to help support the client or the patient to make the changes that they want to make. And so sometimes that looks like alleviating symptoms. Sometimes that looks like, you know, just supportive. I need somebody to listen to me. And sometimes that looks like, you know, really intensive like behavioral changes. Like if the person is addicted to substances or is wanting to like overhaul their life in like many ways or get out of an abusive relationship, sometimes it's more behavioral based. Yeah, but that's the same thing that a therapist does too. So just keep that in mind, that like it's basically the same if you're acting as a therapist, as a clinical psychologist. Let's see. I think the only other difference is that clinical psychologists are trained in assessment, and that's really what differentiates us from like other types of therapists, is that we really are really interested in diagnosing. And so we really focus on doing different assessments for IQ or like cognitive functioning or achievement or like other psychological assessments to like diagnose you with depression or anxiety and stuff like that. We do that, and the only other people that I know that do that in like a therapy role would be if you get special training as a social worker. So that could be totally inaccurate. I don't really know because I'm not in that world, so take that for what it is. And the only other thing is that I feel like as clinical psychologists, we are tasked to deal with the more severe psychopathology as opposed to like what people think a traditional therapist do. So more severe psychopathology, I would say, is like schizophrenia, personality disorders, borderline, anything like that is really, I guess what you consider heavy psychopathology is what clinical psychologists do. And then some of the more common things are like anxiety is pretty prevalent, depression's pretty prevalent in society, and so those tend to be more readily treated by therapists as opposed to like schizophrenia. Sometimes as a therapist you're not able to treat them because it's just more severe psychopathology and they need some more intensive care. So yeah, that's basically it. Those are all my notes. Yeah, so those are basically the differences between being a psychologist, or more specifically a clinical psychologist, and being a therapist. Basically they overlap quite a bit, and it's kind of like the PsyD versus the PhD. There's a lot in common, and basically clinical psychologists often act in a role as therapists, and I know that like I act in a role as a therapist as a clinical psychologist trainee, and so it's just semantics and words and all that good stuff. So basically, thank you so much for checking out this video in the Clinical Psychology Debunked series. There is so much more to come, and I cannot wait for you all to see it. Be sure to share this with people that you think would be interested in learning more about clinical psychology, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I am really good about comments. I'm really good about responding to people, so if you have any questions about sort of the differences, like the nuanced differences between the two that I didn't cover here in this video, be sure to leave those below. Be sure to check me out on my other social medias. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all those places, and those are also down in the description below. And be sure to follow your girl, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out, and I love you all so much. Bye.